A strange homecoming. The familiar click of my key in the lock echoed through the entryway. But tonight, something felt off. The air carried a faint, unfamiliar scent. Cologne, maybe. My fingers hesitated on the brass handle as an almost imperceptible shiver ran through me. I pushed the door open. Our living room lay bathed in the soft, amber glow of the floor lamp, shadows flickering against the walls. The worn leather couch we'd picked out together still dominated the space. But tonight, it wasn't empty. Two figures sat side by side. My wife, Emily, her auburn hair catching the light in waves, and someone else. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a confidence that seemed to take up more room than his physical presence. His crisp white shirt was rolled up at the sleeves, revealing a tattoo winding around his forearm. Something geometric, intricate. His dark eyes flicked to mine with a calm intensity, and he offered a nod, one corner of his mouth curling up in a faint smile. Emily stood abruptly, her movements hesitant, as though caught between reaching for me and staying in place. Her green eyes, usually so open, so warm, darted between us. I saw it then, the way her fingers twisted the hem of her sweater, nervous, guilty. I dropped my bag onto the floor, the thud louder than I'd intended. "What the hell is going on here?" "James," she began, her voice soft but edged with something unsteady. "This is Caleb." The name landed with an almost comical weight in the silent room. Caleb. It sounded too familiar for comfort, too casual. He extended a hand as if this were the most normal introduction in the world. I didn't take it. "Right," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "And Caleb is—" Emily's hand hovered near her stomach. The gesture was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to pull my focus. Her sweater hung a little looser these days, didn't it? Or had I just imagined it? She faltered, glancing at Caleb for support. His hand brushed hers, the motion so instinctive, so natural that it felt like a gut punch. "This can't be happening." "I'm the father of her child," Caleb said, his voice steady and deliberate, as if he were stating a fact, not setting fire to the ground beneath me. For a moment, the room felt as if it had tilted. My knees locked to keep me upright, and the air felt thinner, like I couldn't quite get a full breath. I blinked at them, my mind scrambling for purchase. Her child? Emily stepped forward then, her hand reaching out as if to bridge the widening chasm between us. "James, please, let me explain." "No." I cut her off, my voice barely more than a whisper. "Don't. Not yet." I sank into the armchair across from them, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. My palms felt clammy against the fabric of my trousers. "Think, just think." "What is this?" I asked finally, my voice low, measured. "Some sort of intervention? A family meeting?" Emily's eyes glistened with unshed tears. She opened her mouth to speak, but Caleb answered first. "It's more than that. It's a chance to start fresh, to be honest." "Honest?" I laughed, a bitter sound that echoed around us. "You bring a stranger into my home and announce you're pregnant with his child, and you call it honesty?" The room descended into a tense silence, the kind that made every creak of the floorboards feel deafening. My chest tightened, emotions swirling in a chaotic storm. Disbelief, betrayal, anger. And beneath it all, a deep, aching sadness. I hadn't seen this coming, not even a little. Emily moved closer, her voice trembling as she said, "James, I need you to hear me out. I owe you that much." I stared at her, my gaze hard. "Then start talking." Emily knelt beside me, her presence close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her body, yet distant in every way that mattered. Her hands trembled slightly as they hovered over mine, not quite daring to touch. I leaned back in the chair, folding my arms, and gave her a small nod. Go ahead. She took a deep breath, her shoulders rising and falling in rhythm. When she finally spoke, her words were cautious, measured, as though she feared they might shatter the already fractured air between us. James, she began, her green eyes searching mine for something I couldn't give her right now. I didn't plan for this to happen. I didn't intend for things to change between us. I let out a dry laugh, shaking my head. Didn't intend? Emily, this isn't spilling coffee on the rug. This is our life we're talking about. I know, she whispered, her voice barely audible. And I've been trying to find the right time, the right way to tell you. The right time? My voice rose, an edge of incredulity cutting through the words. You chose tonight? With him? I gestured sharply toward Caleb, who sat stoically, hands clasped in his lap, watching us with an unreadable expression. Sitting here like some invited guest? God, Emily, how long has this been going on? She flinched as if I'd struck her, and guilt pricked at me, unbidden. But I shoved it aside, refusing to let it dilute the anger bubbling beneath my skin. A year, she admitted, her voice cracking. It's been a year. A sharp intake of breath hissed through my teeth. A year. The weight of that number pressed down on me, anchoring me to the chair like chains. And you let me walk around like an idiot, oblivious for an entire year? It wasn't like that, she said quickly, her hands gripping mine now, desperate. I didn't want to hurt you, James. I thought I could figure it out, but you didn't. My voice was low, cold. You brought him here, sat me down like this was some civilized announcement, like we're all adults who can just talk it out. Do you even hear how insane that sounds? She pulled her hands back, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. For a moment, I couldn't look at her. I turned my gaze to Caleb instead. And you, I said, my tone biting. What's your angle in all this? You show up, play the role of the dutiful boyfriend while my wife, does the dirty work? What are you hoping to get out of this? Caleb met my gaze without flinching. I'm not here to antagonize you, James. I'm here because I care about Emily. And about the child. Of course you are. I scoffed, leaning forward, my elbows digging into my knees. How noble. He didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he glanced at Emily, then back at me. This wasn't an easy decision for either of us, but we thought it was time to stop pretending. Pretending? I barked out another humorless laugh. Pretending that what? We were happy? That our marriage meant something? Emily's voice cut through the room, trembling but firm. It does mean something, James. It always has. But it's different now. I'm different now. She placed a hand on her stomach again, and the gesture felt like a slap. I stared at it, unable to ignore the silent declaration it made. This is real. This is happening. The knot in my chest tightened, and my voice dropped to a whisper. Did I ever really know you, Emily? Her face crumpled, and for a moment, she looked like the woman I fell in love with. The woman who laughed with abandon, who danced barefoot in the kitchen, who once told me I was her safe harbor. But now, she was something else entirely. A stranger. A stranger carrying someone else's child. I didn't mean for it to be like this, she said, her voice breaking. But I can't change what's already happened. I need you to know that I still care about you, James. That hasn't changed. I stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor, the sound sharp in the suffocating silence. Care? I repeated, my voice a raw whisper. Is that supposed to be enough? She didn't answer, and in that silence the weight of everything unsaid crushed the air from my lungs. I need some air, I muttered, grabbing my coat and heading for the door. I could feel their eyes on my back, the heavy gaze of two people who had unraveled my world, and I stepped into the cold night before I could crumble completely. The chill bit at my skin as I walked aimlessly, my breath forming clouds in the air. My thoughts churned, questions colliding with memories, emotions tearing at the edges of reason. How do you even begin to rebuild after something like this? Or do you? I didn't have answers. Not yet. But I knew one thing for certain. The man who walked out of that house was not the same one who walked in. A walk into the abyss. The sharp bite of winter wrapped around me as I strode down the street, the icy air stinging my lungs with every breath. My feet moved without direction, crunching over patches of frozen leaves and snow-dusted sidewalks. The world felt muted, as though the weight of my thoughts had drained it of sound and color. Streetlights stretched shadows long and thin across the pavement, their glow casting a surreal haze over the quiet suburban sprawl. I tried to focus on the rhythm of my steps, the crisp snap of cold against my face, but my mind betrayed me, circling back to the living room and the two figures seated there. Emily's words echoed relentlessly, like the chorus of a song I couldn't escape. A year. How had I missed it? I replayed moments from the past 12 months, searching for cracks in the foundation. Her late nights, the unexplained phone calls, the distant look in her eyes that I had chalked up to work stress or fatigue. Had I been blind or simply unwilling to see? My fists clenched involuntarily at my sides, nails biting into my palms. The sting grounded me for a moment, but then Caleb's voice surfaced, calm and steady as he'd spoken of honesty and fresh starts. The gall of it. My jaw tightened. What kind of man walks into another's home and declares himself the father of his wife's child? A street lamp flickered above me as I reached the edge of a small park, the wooden bench near the playground coated in frost. I sat, the cold seeping through my coat as I buried my face in my hands. The sting of the icy wood against my legs was almost welcome, a distraction from the chaos swirling in my chest. What do I do now? The question pulsed through me, relentless and unanswered. For years, Emily had been my anchor, the person I thought I could lean on no matter what. And now she was the storm threatening to pull me under. The sound of soft footfalls on the snow jolted me from my spiral. I looked up, half expecting to see Emily. But it wasn't her. A woman walked her dog, her scarf wrapped tightly around her neck, her breath puffing out in small clouds. She gave me a brief, polite nod before continuing on her way. I stared after her, the ordinary simplicity of the moment striking me like a foreign language. I wanted that simplicity. I wanted normalcy. But how do you go back to something that's been irrevocably shattered? You can't, a bitter voice whispered. In my mind, you either rebuild or you walk away. But how? How do you rebuild when the foundation itself is compromised? The distant hum of a car brought my attention back to the street, and a thought struck me. What if I just keep walking? It wasn't entirely serious, but for a moment, the idea of disappearing, of leaving the mess behind, was intoxicating. No explanations, no confrontations, just silence. But I knew myself too well. That wasn't who I was. If I left, it wouldn't be clean or easy. It would haunt me, like every other unfinished story I'd tried to leave behind. I sighed. The sound, heavy and resigned. My breath misted in the cold air as I stood and began to make my way back, the glow of streetlights guiding me like weary sentinels. Each step felt heavier than the last, my feet dragging under the weight of decisions yet to be made. When I finally reached the house, it loomed in front of me, more shadow than home. The porch light cast a faint, warm glow, a stark contrast to the icy tension I knew awaited me inside. For a moment I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Do I go in? I closed my eyes, the sound of my heartbeat loud in the silence. Then, with a steadying breath, I turned the handle and stepped inside. The warmth hit me immediately, a sharp contrast to the cold that clung to my coat and boots. Emily and Caleb were still seated, though now they were on opposite ends of the couch. She looked up as I entered, her eyes red-rimmed, her expression hesitant. Caleb's gaze followed, his face unreadable but calm. "I didn't think you'd come back," Emily said, her voice soft and uncertain. I shrugged, shrugging off my coat and hanging it on the hook by the door. "It's my house, too." Her face crumpled, but she quickly schooled her expression. "We need to talk." "Yeah," I said, my tone even, though my chest felt tight. "We do." I sat down across from them, my movements deliberate. The three of us sat in a tense triangle, the weight of what was left unsaid pressing down like a lead blanket. "I need to know everything," I said finally, my voice steady but firm. "From the beginning." Emily swallowed hard, glancing at Caleb for a moment before turning back to me. "Okay," she said, her voice trembling. "I'll tell you everything." The whole truth. Emily sat perched on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles pale against her skin. She looked at Caleb briefly, her expression unreadable, before turning her gaze to me. I leaned forward in my chair, my elbows resting on my knees, my fingers interlocked. The air between us felt like a taut wire, threatening to snap. "You said you wanted to know everything," she began, her voice low and unsteady. "So, I'll start from the beginning." I nodded, though my chest tightened with a mix of dread and anger. "Go on," she exhaled deeply, as though preparing to rip off a bandage. "It started last year. You were traveling a lot for work. Here it comes." My jaw tightened, but I said nothing, letting her continue. "I was lonely," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I felt like we were drifting apart, like we were living separate lives under the same roof. And then I met Caleb." I glanced at him sharply, the words igniting a fresh spark of anger in my chest. He met my gaze, his expression calm, but not smug, a neutrality that somehow made me despise him more. Emily pressed on, her words tumbling out now as though she feared she might lose the courage to say them. "It wasn't supposed to turn into anything. He was just someone to talk to, someone who listened. At first it was innocent." "And then it wasn't," I said flatly, my voice cold and hard. She winced but nodded. "No, it wasn't. I know it doesn't justify anything, James, but I felt—" Her voice broke, and she took a moment to compose herself. "I felt seen in a way I hadn't in a long time." I closed my eyes, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. "Seen? You think I don't feel invisible sometimes, Emily? You think I don't feel the weight of everything I do for us, for you?" Her eyes filled with tears, but I wasn't finished. "And instead of talking to me, instead of fighting for us, you turned to him." "I know," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I know I should have come to you, but by the time I realized that, it was already too late. I'd made a mistake, and I didn't know how to undo it." I let the silence stretch between us, the weight of her confession settling like lead in my chest. Finally, I turned to Caleb. "And you? What's your excuse?" He shifted slightly in his seat, his expression carefully measured. "I won't lie and say I regret falling for Emily," he said, his voice steady but soft. "But I do regret the way it happened. I didn't come here to steal her from you, James. I came here because she matters to me, and I want to be there for her and the baby." "The baby," I repeated, the words bitter on my tongue. My eyes locked onto Emily. "And you're sure it's his?" She flinched, as if I'd slapped her, but she nodded. "Yes, I'm sure." The room fell into a suffocating silence, the weight of her words pressing down on me like a vice. My mind raced, each thought more painful than the last. A year. An entire year of lies. And now this. Finally, I spoke, my voice low and raw. So what now? You've upended my life, dropped this bombshell, and what? You expect me to just accept it? Move on? I don't know, Emily admitted, tears streaming down her face. I don't know what I expect, James. I just couldn't keep lying to you. You deserve the truth, even if it's messy and painful. I stood abruptly, pacing the room as my emotions churned violently. Messy and painful? That's what you call this? I gestured wildly, my voice rising. You've destroyed everything, Emily. Everything. Her sobs grew louder, and Caleb reached out as if to comfort her, but I shot him a glare that froze him in place. Don't, I said sharply. Don't you dare! I turned away, my breathing ragged as I tried to process the impossible. My marriage, my trust, my sense of stability, all of it lay in ruins at my feet. I need space, I said finally, my voice hollow. I need time to think. Emily nodded, her face streaked with tears. I understand. Without another word, I grabbed my coat and left again, the door closing behind me with a finality that felt like the end of something irreparable. Fragments of clarity. The cold hit me again as I stepped outside, but this time I welcomed it. The air was sharp and bracing, cutting through the haze of emotions clouding my mind. I needed clarity, some thread of logic to cling to amidst the chaos. The streets were quiet, the world seemingly indifferent to the unraveling of my life. My boots crunched over frost-bitten sidewalks as I wandered aimlessly, my thoughts a storm that refused to settle. Why didn't I see it? The question looped endlessly, gnawing at my sense of self. Was I that blind? Or was I just in denial? The image of Emily sitting on the couch, tears streaming down her face, resurfaced in my mind. I clenched my fists, a bitter cocktail of anger, and heartbreak coursing through me. She had been my partner, my confidant, the person I trusted most, and she had broken that trust with a single, deliberate choice. But even in my anger, there was a small, insidious whisper. You weren't perfect. Either. I stopped abruptly, the thought hitting me like a punch to the gut. Had I been as present as I thought? I'd spent years focused on providing, on building a life for us. But had I neglected the very foundation of our relationship? Was my failure to see her loneliness a betrayal of its own kind? I found myself at a small diner on the corner of Main and Pine, its neon sign buzzing faintly against the stillness of the night. The warmth inside was inviting, and before I realized it, I was seated at the counter with a cup of coffee in front of me. The waitress, a woman in her late 40s with kind eyes and a tired smile, refilled my mug without a word. She seemed to sense that I wasn't in the mood for small talk. I stared into the steaming liquid, the bitter aroma grounding me in the moment. What now? The question lingered, heavy and unanswered. I knew I had decisions to make, but every option felt like a lose-lose scenario. Staying meant trying to rebuild a marriage that might never recover. Leaving meant walking away from years of shared history, and leaving the door wide open for Caleb to step in without resistance. And then there's the baby. The thought brought a fresh wave of pain. I had always imagined us having children, raising a family together. Now that future felt stolen, replaced with something I couldn't bear to picture. How could I ever look at that child and not feel the shadow of betrayal? I sighed deeply, the weight of everything pressing down on me. The waitress glanced at me again, her expression sympathetic but unobtrusive. For a moment I considered spilling my story to her, this stranger who knew nothing about me, but I dismissed the thought almost as quickly as it came. Some things were too personal, too raw to share with anyone who wasn't directly involved. Hours passed as I sat there, lost in thought. By the time I left the diner, the sky was beginning to lighten, the first hints of dawn creeping over the horizon. The cold air felt sharper now, the promise of a new day doing little to soothe the ache in my chest. When I finally returned home, the house was silent. Emily was asleep on the couch, her face pale and drawn even in rest. Caleb was gone, his presence replaced by an emptiness that somehow felt heavier. I stood in the doorway, watching her sleep, torn between love and anger, between the desire to comfort her and the urge to walk away for good. What do I do? The question hung in the air, unanswered. But as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the curtains, I realized one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever choice I made, it would define not only my future but hers, and the life of the child she carried. The conversation that couldn't wait. The sun was fully up when Emily stirred, the faint rustle of her movement pulling me from my reverie. I had been sitting in the armchair by the window for what felt like hours, staring at nothing, replaying the night's events in my head. When her eyes fluttered open and met mine, I saw the flash of guilt and apprehension in them before she quickly sat up, smoothing her hair and tugging at the blanket draped over her. "You came back," she said, softly, her voice still rough from sleep. I nodded but didn't respond right away. My gaze shifted to the mug of cold coffee I held, a bitter remnant of my hours spent overthinking. "We need to talk." Emily swallowed hard, her hands twisting together in her lap. "I know." I set the mug down on the side table, leaning forward with my elbows on my knees. "I need to understand, Emily. I need to understand why. Why didn't you come to me? Why didn't you think we could work through whatever you were feeling?" She looked away, her eyes filling with tears. "I was scared, James. Scared that you wouldn't listen, or that you'd see it as me blaming you when it wasn't about that." And then it just felt easier to bury it than to risk breaking us. "Easier?" I repeated, my voice sharp despite my attempt to stay calm. "How is lying to me for a year and sleeping with someone else easier than talking to me? How is bringing him into our home and telling me you're having his child easier?" She winced, her tears falling freely now. "It wasn't easy. It was awful. And I hated myself for it every day." I stared at her, the rawness of her confession doing little to temper the anger simmering beneath the surface. "And yet you kept doing it." "I was selfish," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was so caught up in how I felt, how unseen and disconnected I felt, that I didn't stop to think about what I was doing to you. And by the time I realized, I didn't know how to fix it." Her words hung in the air, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. My hands gripped the armrests of the chair, my knuckles white as I tried to find some semblance of calm. "What do you want from me now, Emily?" I finally asked, my voice quiet but firm. "What do you see happening next?" She looked at me, her eyes pleading. "I want to try to make things right. I want to rebuild what we had, if that's even possible. But I also know I don't have the right to ask that of you." "You're right. You don't," I said, the words sharper than I intended. I took a deep breath, running a hand through my hair. "Do you love him?" Her eyes widened slightly, and for a moment she didn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was shaky. I don't know. I thought I did, but now, I don't know if it was real or just a way to fill the void I felt." I leaned back, exhaling slowly. "And what about me? Do you still love me? Or was that just something convenient to hold on to while you figured out what you wanted?" Tears spilled down her cheeks as she nodded fervently. "I do love you, James. I always have. That never changed, even when I made the worst choices of my life." Her words felt like a balm and a dagger all at once, soothing and wounding in equal measure. I rubbed my temples, my mind spinning. This isn't something we can fix overnight, and honestly, I don't even know if it's something we can fix. I know, she said, her voice trembling, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I'll go to counseling, I'll give you space, whatever you need. Just don't give up on us yet, please. Her plea hung in the air, heavy and desperate. I looked at her. The woman I had loved for years, now a stranger in so many ways, and as much as I wanted to shout, to rage, to walk away and never look back, I felt the faintest glimmer of something else, a flicker of hope, however fragile. I can't make any promises, I said finally, my voice low, but I'll think about it. Her face crumpled with relief, and she nodded. That's all I can ask. As I stood and walked toward the door, I felt the weight of her gaze on my back. I paused, my hand on the doorknob, before glancing over. My shoulder. This doesn't mean I forgive you, Emily. It just means I'm not ready to decide yet. And with that, I stepped outside, leaving her in the silence she had created, and me in the storm of emotions I had yet to face. Rebuilding or breaking? The days that followed were a delicate dance, each step feeling like it could shatter what remained of us. Emily and I moved around each other cautiously, speaking only when necessary, our words strained and heavy. The silence between us was louder than any argument could have been, filled with unspoken questions and unresolved pain. At my insistence, Caleb was no longer part of the equation. Emily had agreed without hesitation, assuring me that their relationship was over. But his absence didn't erase the damage. It only removed the most immediate reminder. I had taken the guest room, the space where I could close the door and process everything without her constant presence. It felt like I was standing on the edge of a precipice, staring into the void, unsure whether I should step back or fall. One evening, after days of this tense limbo, Emily approached me. Her face was pale but determined, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I've made an appointment with a counselor," she said softly. "For us, if you're willing." I studied her for a moment, my heart a war zone of conflicting emotions. Part of me wanted to scoff, to dismiss her efforts as too little, too late. But another part, the part that still remembered the woman I had fallen in love with, felt a faint flicker of hope. "When is it?" I asked, my tone neutral. "Tomorrow afternoon," she replied, her eyes searching mine for any sign of acceptance. I nodded curtly. "I'll go, but don't expect this to fix everything." "I don't," she said quickly. I want to try." The counseling office was small but inviting, with warm lighting and comfortable chairs arranged in a circle. The therapist, a woman in her 50s with a calm demeanor and kind eyes, introduced herself as Dr. Hayes. "I want to start by acknowledging how difficult this must be for both of you," she began, her voice soothing. "Healing from something like this isn't easy, but it is possible if both of you are committed to the process." I glanced at Emily, who was nodding earnestly. I couldn't help but feel a pang of resentment. She had already decided she was ready to do whatever it took, but I wasn't so sure. Dr. Hayes turned her attention to me. "James, would you like to start by sharing how you're feeling?" I hesitated, the words caught in my throat. Finally, I spoke, my voice low and strained. "I feel betrayed, angry, confused. I keep replaying everything in my head, trying to figure out what I missed, what I did wrong." Emily opened her mouth to speak, but Dr. Hayes held up a hand. "Let him finish." I took a deep breath, my gaze fixed on the floor. I don't know if I can ever trust her again, and without trust, I don't know what's left. Emily's tears started to fall, but she stayed silent, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. Dr. Hayes nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Emily, how does hearing that make you feel?" "It hurts," she said, her voice trembling. but I understand why he feels that way. I hurt him in the worst way possible, and I don't know if I can ever make it right. All I can do is try." Her words felt sincere, but sincerity wasn't enough to undo the damage. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms over my chest. "Trying isn't always enough," Dr. Hayes interjected gently. "It's true that effort alone won't fix this. Rebuilding trust takes time, and it requires both of you to be honest about what you need and how you're feeling. James, what would it take for you to consider moving forward?" I thought for a long moment before answering. "I need transparency. No more secrets, no more half-truths. And I need to feel like I matter to her, not just as a provider, but as a partner." Emily nodded, her expression solemn. "You do matter, James. More than anything." The session ended with no clear resolution, but it felt like a start, a fragile, tentative beginning. As we walked to the car, the silence between us felt slightly less oppressive, as if the weight had shifted, if only slightly. "I meant what I said in there," Emily said quietly as we pulled into the driveway. "I want to prove to you that I'm still the person you fell in love with." I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I turned off the engine and looked at her. "Words are easy, Emily. Actions are what matter now." She nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "Then I'll show you." The counseling sessions, a delicate thread. The counseling sessions became a new routine in our lives, a fragile thread connecting us when everything else seemed to be unraveling. Every week we sat in that small room, the neutral tones of the walls and soft chairs offering no comfort against the storm inside me. Dr. Hayes was patient, always gentle, but I could tell she understood that time was running out. We couldn't keep circling the same painful truths without something giving way, either the bond between us or the remnants of whatever trust I had left. In our second session, Dr. Hayes asked us to explore the concept of forgiveness, what it really meant, what it would look like, and if it was something we could even consider. "James," she said softly, looking directly at me, "what does forgiveness look like to you? Is it possible?" I could feel the weight of her gaze, but I refused to meet it, focusing instead on the way my hands trembled slightly in my lap. I had not forgiven anyone for something like this. Not ever. The thought of it felt like surrender, and I wasn't sure I was ready to let go of the rage that simmered just beneath the surface. "I don't know what forgiveness looks like," I said after a long pause, my voice hoarse. "I thought I knew, but it's different when it's something that feels so final. Betrayal doesn't come with a clean slate. It doesn't give you a chance to make things right." Dr. Hayes nodded, her expression understanding. "It's true that forgiveness doesn't always mean a return to the way things were. It's about moving forward with or without the person who hurt you." Emily shifted in her seat, her eyes not leaving me, as though willing me to hear her. "James," she said, her voice gentle, "I want you to know that I understand how hard this is for you. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, or maybe ever, but I'm here to prove that I can be the person you need me to be again." I looked at her then, my heart heavy with conflict. Her words were so sincere, yet there was a bitterness lingering in me that wouldn't let go. "I don't know if I need you to be anything right now, Emily. I don't know if I want you to be anything." Her face fell, and I could see the vulnerability she had tried so hard to hide. But Dr. Hayes intervened before either of us could speak again. "James, I hear your pain. And Emily, I hear your remorse. But healing cannot come from avoiding the hard conversations, the things we're afraid to say. Can you be honest with yourself about what you truly need from each other?" It was this question, one I hadn't dared to ask myself, that hung in the air for days after the session. What did I need from Emily? The simple answer was trust. But trust was such an abstract concept now, something that had been violated, so thoroughly that I wasn't sure it was possible to rebuild. That night, Emily and I sat in the kitchen, the dim glow of the overhead light casting shadows across the counter. She had been cooking, an attempt at normalcy, at showing me that she could still do the little things that made our life together hers as much as mine. But I couldn't focus on the aroma of the food or the steady sound of her movements. My mind kept circling back to the question, "What do you need from her, James?" I looked at her as she set the pan down on the stove, her back to me for a moment. She was trying so hard I could see it in every movement, in the way she wore her regret, like a second skin. "Emily," I said, my voice breaking the silence, "I don't know how to forgive you." She turned slowly, meeting my gaze. "I'm not asking you to. Not yet. But I'm willing to earn it, James. Every day if I have to." I looked down, taking a slow breath. Can I even let her try? "I'm still not sure I want to try," I admitted, the words tasting bitter. "I'm scared that if I do, I'll be stuck here forever, caught between what you did and what we could be." She stepped toward me then, her eyes full of quiet desperation. "I understand. But I need you to understand that I'm not asking you to forget. I'm asking you to allow me to show you that I'm not the person who hurt you. I want to prove that we're worth fighting for." Her words were a promise, a thread I could grasp or let slip through my fingers. I didn't answer her right away, my mind a tangle of uncertainty and hurt. But deep down, I knew one thing. Whatever I chose would change everything. The third session with Dr. Hayes focused on forgiveness in practice. How did we move beyond the pain? What steps could we take together or separately to rebuild something resembling trust? The questions were endless, but the answers felt like they were just out of reach, like a distant shore I wasn't sure I could swim to. Dr. Hayes looked at both of us. "Healing will not happen in a vacuum," she said. "You both need to put in the work, but not just for the sake of staying together. You need to heal for yourselves. A war within. The weight of forgiveness." The quiet moments were the worst. When the world settled and I was left alone with my thoughts, it felt as though my mind turned into a courtroom. Every memory of us together, the laughter, the shared dreams, the intimacy, was presented as evidence of what we once had. And against it, the betrayal loomed large, an unassailable argument against any notion of reconciliation. Late one night, I sat alone in the guest room, the dim light of a bedside lamp, casting long shadows across the walls. The room felt foreign to me, an echo of the life I had once inhabited. On the dresser sat a photograph of Emily and me from years ago, taken on a trip to the mountains. We were smiling, arms wrapped around each other, our faces flushed from the cold. It felt like looking at strangers. Was that happiness real? I wondered, tracing the edge of the frame with my thumb. Or was it just the prelude to this? The thought unsettled me. I set the frame down and leaned back in the chair, closing my eyes. My chest tightened with the weight of everything I hadn't said, everything I wasn't sure I could say. "You don't have to forgive her," a voice in my head whispered. "She's the one who broke this. She's the one who betrayed you." But another voice, quieter yet persistent, countered. "Do you really want to live like this? Holding on to the anger forever?" I opened my eyes, the two voices merging into a cacophony of doubt. I knew what I needed wasn't simple. It wasn't just about forgiveness. It was about figuring out who I was in the aftermath of this. I wasn't the same person I had been before the betrayal, and I wasn't sure who I was becoming. The next morning, I found myself standing in the kitchen, staring out the window as the sun rose over the horizon. Emily entered quietly, her footsteps hesitant as though afraid to disturb the fragile peace. She stopped a few feet away, clutching a mug of coffee like it was her lifeline. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked softly, her voice tentative. "No," I replied, not turning to face her. The weight of her presence was palpable, like a storm, cloud, hovering just out of reach. She set her mug down and took a step closer. I've been thinking about what Dr. Hayes said, about healing for ourselves. Her words hung in the air, and I finally turned to look at her. She looked small, fragile in a way I had never seen before. It wasn't just guilt that weighed on her. It was fear. Fear that I would leave, that I would decide we weren't worth the effort. "And what did you decide?" I asked, my voice devoid of emotion. She hesitated, her fingers twisting together. "I realized that I've been trying to fix us without really understanding what's broken in me. I want to start individual therapy, not just for us, but for me, because I know I can't ask you to forgive me if I don't understand why I did what I did." Her admission caught me off guard. For the first time, she wasn't just apologizing or promising to change. She was taking ownership of her actions in a way that felt different, more honest. "That's a start," I said finally, the words feeling heavy yet significant. Emily nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I don't expect it to fix everything, but I want you to know that I'm committed to doing the work, whether you choose to stay or not." That night, as I lay in bed, her words echoed in my mind, "whether you choose to stay or not." It was the first time she had acknowledged the possibility that I might leave and that she would have to accept it. It made me wonder if forgiveness was really about her at all, or if it was something I needed to give myself. In the following days, I began to confront the deeper truths I had avoided. I asked myself hard questions. Was I holding on to the anger because it was easier than facing my own fears? Was I afraid that forgiving her would mean letting go of the identity I had built around being the betrayed party? Each question felt like a small crack in the wall I had built around myself. And with each crack, a faint light began to seep through, just enough to make me question whether the wall was worth keeping intact. Bridging the divide. Steps toward healing. Emily's decision to start individual therapy brought a shift in the atmosphere of our shared space. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, like the first rays of sunlight after a long storm. There was still tension, still moments when silence hung heavy between us, but there was also an underlying current of change. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something. Dr. Hayes noticed it too in our next counseling session. "You both seem more grounded today," she said, her gaze moving between us. "What's changed?" Emily answered first. "I've started therapy. It's been challenging, but I feel like I'm beginning to understand things about myself that I hadn't confronted before." Dr. Hayes nodded approvingly before turning to me. "And you, James? How are you feeling about this shift?" I hesitated, searching for the right words. "I'm conflicted," I admitted. On one hand, I can see that Emily's trying, she's making an effort, but on the other hand, I still don't know if I can move past what happened. "That's a valid feeling," Dr. Hayes said gently. "Healing doesn't mean erasing the past. It means learning how to live with it in a way that doesn't consume you." Her words resonated with me, though I wasn't sure I was ready to embrace their full meaning. I still carried the weight of the betrayal like a shield, a way to protect myself from the vulnerability of hope. Later that evening, Emily and I sat together in the living room, a rare occurrence in recent weeks. The television was on, but neither of us was really watching. I could feel her presence beside me, a quiet, nervous energy that made my chest tighten. "James," she said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Can I ask you something?" I glanced at her, wary but curious. "What is it?" "What do you need from me right now?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Not in the long term, not about the future, just right now. What can I do to help you?" The question caught me off guard. It was so simple, yet it felt monumental. For weeks, I had been so consumed by my own pain that I hadn't considered what I actually needed from her in the moment. I don't know, I admitted after a long pause. Maybe just honesty, no matter how hard it is. Her brow furrowed, and I could see her wrestling with something. Okay, she said finally. Then I need to be honest with you about something. My chest tightened. Go on. I'm scared, she said, her voice breaking. I'm scared that no matter how much I change, no matter how hard I try, it won't be enough. That I've already ruined any chance we had to rebuild this. Her vulnerability was palpable, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to tell her that everything would be okay. But another part, the part that still carried the weight of her betrayal, held back. Maybe it's not about being enough, I said finally. Maybe it's about showing up anyway, even when it's hard, even when it feels impossible. Her eyes glistened with tears as she nodded. I'll keep showing up, James. For you, for us, even if it takes years. The conversation lingered with me long after she had gone to bed. For the first time, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't dared to acknowledge. Hope. It was fragile, tenuous, but it was there, and it scared me as much as it comforted me. The next steps in our journey felt uncertain, like walking a tightrope, without knowing if there was a net below. But for the first time, I felt like I wasn't walking it alone. Emily was beside me, not asking for forgiveness, but offering something else, commitment. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. Rebuilding. Together. Small acts of commitment. It wasn't the grand gestures that started to shift the dynamic between Emily and me, but the small, everyday things. The quiet moments where she showed up, really showed up, not as someone trying to fix everything, but as someone who was genuinely trying to be there in the moment, without expectation. The next morning, I woke to the smell of coffee and the soft sound of Emily humming in the kitchen. I wasn't sure when I'd started to notice these things, the little noises that filled the space between us. But now, they felt different. There was a tentative peace in the air, as if we were both waiting for something to unfold, but not, pushing for it to happen too quickly. I made my way into the kitchen, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. Emily was standing at the counter flipping pancakes. She smiled when she saw me, a small, unsure smile that seemed to say, I'm trying. You're up early, I said, trying to sound casual, though I could feel the weight of everything pressing down on my shoulders. I wanted to make breakfast, she replied, turning to me with a slight blush. Something normal, you know. Just, for us. The gesture, so simple, hit me in a way I hadn't expected. It wasn't about the pancakes. It was about her willingness to step back into the role she used to play in my life, to take up space in a way that wasn't about fixing or apologizing. Thank you, I said quietly, my voice unexpectedly thick. I couldn't remember the last time I had thanked her for something like this, but it felt like the right thing to do. Emily didn't say anything, just nodded, her gaze flickering to mine before she turned back to the stove. She didn't need to say anything. The action spoke louder than words ever could. Over the next few days, we began to ease back into the rhythms of our life. It was slow, tentative, like learning how to walk again after an injury. But each small step, each unspoken act of care, was a bridge we built between the gap that had separated us. We took walks together in the evenings, the kind of walks we had taken when we were first dating. No heavy conversations, just the steady rhythm of our feet on the pavement, the quiet hum of the world around us. For the first time in weeks, I found myself enjoying her presence, not out of obligation, but because I genuinely wanted to be there with her. One evening, as we sat on the porch, the sky fading into twilight, Emily spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. James, I know I can't take back what happened. I just want you to know that I'm committed to doing the work, to being the person you need me to be. Her words didn't carry the same desperation they had before. They weren't a plea for forgiveness. They were a promise, one she was willing to keep even if it took a lifetime. I looked at her then, really looked at her, the way the soft light caught her features, the way her eyes held a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. And for the first time in a long while, I wasn't angry. I wasn't full of doubt or resentment. I just saw her for who she was now, the person standing before me trying to make things right. I see you, Emily, I said softly, and I believe you. It wasn't a moment of grand revelation. There was no sudden, sweeping forgiveness that washed over me like a wave. But there was something just as important, a recognition of the work we both had to do, individually and together, a commitment to not give up on the possibility of healing. We didn't have all the answers, but we had something, and sometimes that was enough to start again. Rediscovery. A quiet rebuilding. As the days turned into weeks, the space between Emily and me gradually shifted. It wasn't something that could be rushed, no matter how much either of us wished for the weight of the past to simply lift. But the heaviness seemed to lessen, like fog lifting slowly under the warmth of the sun. One evening, after dinner, Emily suggested we take a drive. It was a spontaneous idea, one that carried no agenda, just a simple escape. Let's go somewhere, she said, her eyes bright with a mixture of curiosity and hesitation. Somewhere we can talk. Or not talk. Just be together. It felt like an invitation to reclaim something that had been lost, a way to reconnect without the weight of expectation. We drove in silence for a while, the hum of the tires on the road and the occasional sigh of the car's engine, the only sounds. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain, and as we approached the outskirts of town, Emily turned the radio on softly, the familiar strains of a song we used to love playing in the background. I glanced over at her, her hands on the wheel, her fingers lightly tapping along with the rhythm. She looked at peace in that moment. Her expression relaxed, almost as if the stress of everything had momentarily fallen away, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the weight of her guilt pressing against me. I just saw her, as she was now, trying, unsure, yet still here. This song, I started, the words coming out almost before I realized I had them. It used to be our song, didn't it? She nodded, her lips curving into a small smile. Yeah, we used to play it on repeat when we were on those weekend drives, remember? The memory hit me in a way I hadn't expected. It was a time before the pain, before the betrayal, when everything between us felt easy, effortless. I found myself smiling at the thought, the music drawing us back into a moment where things weren't so complicated. I remember, I said quietly, my voice soft, almost reflective. We drove aimlessly for a while, heading into the countryside, where the lights of the town faded into nothingness, leaving only the stars overhead and the darkened road stretching before us. Eventually, we parked by a quiet field, the grass rustling in the cool breeze. We didn't say anything immediately, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like a pause, a space between words where both of us could just exist without needing to explain anything. Emily turned to me, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the dashboard light. James, she began, her voice tentative. I know we're not where we used to be, and I know I can't change everything all at once, but I just need you to know that I'm here, and I'm going to keep showing up for us, even if it's slow. The honesty in her words resonated deeply within me. It wasn't a promise that things would be fixed overnight. It was a promise to continue, to stay present in the work of rebuilding. I know, I said, meeting her gaze. I can see that. I need time. Her eyes softened and she nodded, her hand reaching out to rest briefly on mine. There was no rush, no urgency in the touch. It was simple, quiet, but it felt like everything, like a shared understanding of the weight we were both carrying. Time, she agreed. We have time. As we sat together, the quiet of the night enveloping us, I realized that maybe we didn't need all the answers right now. Maybe we didn't need to solve everything in one go. What mattered was that we were still here, still willing to show up for each other, even if it was in small ways. Even if the road ahead was uncertain, it was still a road we were walking together, step by step. I didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, I felt something that I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Fragile, but real. The kind of hope that comes not from grand gestures or sweeping changes, but from the quiet, steady actions that slowly, carefully rebuild what was broken. How would you like to continue? Should we explore a turning point in their relationship or shift focus to another aspect of their personal healing journeys? A turning point. Facing the past weeks passed, and the quiet rebuilding between Emily and me began to take root. But, as often happens, progress was not linear. The past had a way of resurfacing, sometimes in ways we couldn't predict, and as much as we tried to keep moving forward, the shadow of what had happened still lingered, like an unresolved chord in a song. One Friday evening, after we'd spent the day together, a rare gift in the whirlwind of our hectic lives, Emily turned to me with an expression that was heavier than usual. She was sitting across from me on the couch, her hands clenched together in her lap. The small space between us suddenly felt charged, like the quiet before a storm. "I think it's time," she said, her voice steady but laced with a quiet intensity, "for you to meet him." For a moment, I didn't register what she meant. My mind buzzed, my thoughts tangled together in a mess of confusion and sudden panic. "Meet who?" I asked, though I already knew. "Mark," she said softly, her eyes meeting mine with a vulnerability that made my chest tighten. "My boyfriend. The father of my child." The words hung in the air, hanging heavy between us. I could feel my pulse quicken, the blood rushing to my face, my heart beating erratically in my chest. I hadn't expected this moment to come so soon. Not like this. Not with so little preparation. I trailed off, struggling to keep my voice even. "I thought we were still figuring things out." "We are," she said quickly, her gaze softening with an apology. "But James, you need to meet him. We need to start confronting this reality, no matter how hard it is." The air in the room seemed to thicken. I felt the weight of her words settle on me, each syllable like a small stone being placed in the pit of my stomach. This was it, the moment that would challenge everything I thought I had been building with her. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out at first. It was as though my body couldn't keep up with my mind, like I was stuck in the space between what I wanted to say and what I actually felt. "I'm not ready," I whispered, the words barely escaping my throat. I had prepared myself for many things in this journey, but this was different. Meeting him, the man who had become a part of her life in the most profound way, felt like an assault on everything I thought we were rebuilding. "I understand," Emily said, her voice full of empathy. "But I need you to know him. I need you to know the person I'm starting this chapter with. I can't keep him hidden from you. Not anymore." My mind raced, my thoughts scattered like leaves in the wind. I had known this moment would come, eventually, but the reality of it, the overwhelming truth of it, hit me harder than I had anticipated. I had spent so much time navigating my own pain, my own confusion, that I hadn't truly considered what Emily was going through, what she was asking me to face. This wasn't just about her betrayal anymore. This was about her life, their life, and the reality that, no matter how much I tried to move past it, it was something I couldn't erase. It was a truth I had to face. The silence between us stretched out, long and filled with tension. Emily, watching me closely, seemed to wait for something. Maybe for me to say yes, or maybe just for me to take the first step. "I'll meet him," I said finally, my voice strained but determined. "But I need a little more time to prepare myself." Emily nodded, a small smile pulling at the corners of her lips. It wasn't one of triumph, but one of relief. She had made her choice, and now I had to make mine. The road ahead was jagged and uncertain, but there was no turning back. We would face this, together, in whatever way we could. As I sat there, the weight of the decision settling deep within me, I realized something. This moment, this confrontation with the past, wasn't just about Emily and Mark. It was about me. It was about understanding that healing wasn't a straight line. It was a series of steps forward, then back, then forward again. And sometimes those steps meant walking straight into the thing you feared the most. And though I wasn't ready, though I didn't know how I would handle what lay ahead, I also understood that this was the only way forward, not just for Emily and me, but for myself. The meeting, confronting the past. The day of the meeting arrived quietly, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. It wasn't the grand confrontation I had imagined, no dramatic arguments or tearful confessions. It was simply a moment, one I had no choice but to face. And even in its simplicity, it felt like a test, one that would either break me or change me in ways I couldn't yet understand. Emily and I agreed to meet Mark at a small park near her apartment, a neutral place where we wouldn't be bound by the confines of her home or the pressure of any particular setting. It seemed as good a place as any, though my hands were still shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, the anticipation making my pulse race faster than the car could travel. I tried to steady my breathing, but it didn't work. Each inhale felt too shallow, too tight. What would he be like? Would I see something in him that made me feel even worse, even more inadequate? Would the weight of everything, his presence, her pregnancy, collapse me in ways I wasn't prepared for? But I wasn't just afraid of him. I was afraid of what meeting him would do to me. Could I hold on to the fragile peace I'd started to find with Emily? Could I remain open, willing to continue the work of healing? Or would this be the moment that shattered everything? I glanced at Emily beside me, her face unreadable. She had been the one to initiate this meeting, and while I could see the anxiety in her eyes, I also saw something else. Resolve. She had made her choice, and now she was holding the door open, waiting for me to step through. She was giving me the space to choose, but it was clear that she couldn't wait forever. "We'll be okay," she said, breaking the silence as we neared the park. Her voice was soft but firm. I didn't respond immediately, not because I didn't want to, but because I wasn't sure what to say. I wanted to believe her. But would we be okay? Could things really ever be okay after everything? When we arrived, Mark was already there, standing near a bench under the shade of a large oak tree. He was taller than I expected, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp, focused on us as we approached. There was a calm confidence in the way he stood, but it wasn't arrogance. It was something else, something unsettlingly calm. He saw us coming, and there was no hesitation in his movements as he stepped forward. His gaze briefly flickered to me, then to Emily, before he extended a hand toward me. I didn't know what to do at first. My body tensed, unsure of the right response. But I forced myself to take a breath and shook his hand. It was firm, but his grip didn't linger longer than necessary, as if he knew the space between us had to be respected. "James," Mark said, his voice steady, almost neutral, "I've heard a lot about you." I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. What could I say? It was hard to make small talk in a situation like this. There was too much history, too much tension between us for pleasantries to feel genuine. "Thanks for agreeing to meet," Emily said, her voice light but the tension in her posture betraying her nerves. "I thought it would be good for you two to at least meet." I couldn't help but notice the way she kept glancing between us, almost like she was waiting for something, an agreement, a tension to break, a truce to form. But nothing felt settled. Not yet. We stood there for a few moments, the air thick with unspoken words. I studied Mark more closely now. He wasn't what I had expected. He wasn't some villain from a story I had built in my head. He was simply a man, flawed perhaps, but no more or less than anyone else. He wasn't the enemy. The enemy was the situation itself, the complications, the truth of our shared past. "How are you?" I finally asked, my voice rougher than I'd intended. I didn't want to come across as confrontational, but I needed to know something, anything, that would let me begin to process this moment. Mark looked at me almost as if considering my question before he spoke. "I'm adjusting," he said. "It's not easy, but I'm trying to make things right. For Emily. For the baby." His words were simple, but there was a quiet sincerity in them. I could see that he wasn't here to start a fight or assert some kind of dominance. He was here because Emily had asked him to be, because this was the reality now, and whether I liked it or not, we all had to find a way to live in it. Emily stepped closer to me, her hand brushing against mine briefly, grounding me in the midst of all the chaos I was feeling inside. I felt the tension begin to ease, just a little, as she gave me a small, reassuring smile. "We're going to have to find a way to make this work," she said quietly, but with an undeniable firmness in her voice. "All of us. For the baby." The next few minutes felt like a blur, awkward introductions, tentative conversation, a strange sense of peace hanging over us, the strain of acceptance. James's inner journey. The meeting with Mark was a moment I had been dreading, yet I realized it wasn't the meeting itself that hurt me the most. It was what followed. The quiet, lingering ache in my chest that refused to dissipate, even after we parted ways. Even after the words were spoken, after Emily and I had returned to the comfort of our home, I felt unsettled, like a ship drifting aimlessly in a sea of uncertainty. I lay awake that night, the soft rhythm of Emily's breath beside me barely enough to keep me tethered to the present. Her hand rested gently against my chest, but even her touch, comforting, warm, wasn't enough to calm the storm inside me. How did I get here, I wondered. How did we all get here? In the dim light of the room, I traced the outlines of the ceiling with my eyes, searching for something, anything, that could anchor me. But all I saw were shadows of what had been, what might have been, and what was. Mark's face, calm and steady, flickered through my mind. His voice was still clear in my ears, an undercurrent of sincerity running through his words. But there was something beneath it, something I couldn't put my finger on. Why did this feel like a betrayal of me, of us? The answer didn't come right away, but slowly, as my thoughts swirled and collided, it became clear. I wasn't just facing the reality of Emily's pregnancy. I was facing the reality of my own inability to move past the past. The days that followed were a strange kind of purgatory. I was there, physically present, but emotionally scattered. Like I was watching my own life unfold from a distance, too afraid to fully engage. I tried to focus on the small things, making breakfast, helping around the house, but every moment felt like an effort. My mind kept slipping back to Mark, to the image of Emily, telling me in such a measured voice that we needed to make this work, that the baby was our future. It should have been simple. I should have made it simple. But it wasn't. One afternoon, As I sat on the couch, my thoughts a mess of jagged edges, Emily entered the room. She was carrying a few shopping bags, groceries, I assumed. Her expression was soft, but there was an underlying tension in her shoulders, as though she was walking on a tightrope, balancing between what she needed from me and what I was capable of giving. "James," she said, pausing in the doorway. "I know this is hard. I know you're struggling with this." I didn't look at her. My gaze was fixed on the floor, my mind still wrestling with itself, with the emotions I wasn't ready to confront. "I don't know how to do this," I admitted quietly. My voice cracked with the weight of unspoken feelings, a raw honesty I couldn't keep buried any longer. "I want to be okay. I want to believe that we can find a way forward. But I don't know if I'm capable of it." Emily's footsteps were light as she approached, her presence a gentle pull that eased the tension in the room. She knelt beside the couch, her hand resting softly on my knee. There was a tenderness in her touch, but also a weight to it, a reminder of the reality we were trying to navigate together. "You don't have to have all the answers right now," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "But you are capable of it, James. I believe that. I need you to believe that too." Her words were meant to be comforting, and yet they did little to quell the storm inside me. I felt like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down into a vast, unknown abyss. What if I couldn't handle it? What if I wasn't strong enough to face the man she had chosen, the father of her child? It wasn't just about Mark. It wasn't even about the pregnancy anymore. It was about Emily, who she had become in my absence, and who I was becoming in the aftermath of it all. I spent the next few days in a haze, caught in the tension between wanting to move on and being utterly incapable of it. Each time I tried to reach out to Emily, to hold on to the fragile thread we had left, something within me recoiled. A fear I couldn't name, a sense that no matter how hard I tried to fix what was broken, it would never be enough. And yet, I couldn't walk away. Not from her. Not from the future that was now entwined with the life we had created. The child she carried would be a part of both of us, whether I liked it or not. How do I embrace this reality? I asked myself. How do I make peace with it? I knew I needed to take a step, to begin the work of healing, or else the weight of everything would crush me under its enormity. But how? Where to even begin? And then it hit me. I wasn't just afraid of Mark, I was afraid of losing Emily, of losing the family we had once, been and had the potential to be again. In that moment, I understood that my struggle wasn't about Mark at all. It was about my own fear that the pieces of us would never fit together again. The heavy weight of change, James's internal struggle. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that nothing had truly changed. I had always been someone who lived in the spaces between past and future, between doubt and hope. I was accustomed to the tension of things unresolved. But this was different. This was life being reshaped before me, and I had no choice but to learn how to navigate it. The hardest part, though, wasn't the pregnancy. It wasn't even Mark. It was the way I was forcing myself to confront things that, until recently, I had been too afraid to acknowledge. The future. Emily. Our future. I couldn't keep running from what was happening. It wasn't just happening to her. It was happening to me, too. We were bound together in this, bound by the child growing inside her, by the fragile thread of our relationship, by the choices we had both made. But as much as I knew that, my mind still rebelled against it. It fought against the reality of this new family dynamic. There was too much I didn't understand. Too much I didn't know how to fix. The next morning, after another restless night spent turning over thoughts that led nowhere, I found myself standing by the kitchen window, staring out at the early morning light as it spilled over the city below. The cool air from the open window touched my face, and I inhaled deeply, as if trying to inhale clarity. I could hear Emily moving about behind me, making coffee, her soft footsteps a reminder that she was there, a constant in my life despite everything, despite him, despite the child. She didn't speak for a long while, letting the silence stretch between us. And that silence felt heavier than any words could have been. It was a silence that held questions, fears, and uncertainties. Things that neither of us wanted to address, but that we both knew we had to. Finally, she broke it. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice tentative but filled with an undertone of concern. She didn't touch me, didn't try to close the distance between us. She simply waited. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked out the window, my fingers pressing against the cool glass. The world beyond seemed so untouched by the storm inside me. It felt like everything outside was moving forward, but I was stuck. "I don't know," I admitted. The words came out raw, like they'd been buried for so long that they had no choice but to emerge now, unrefined. "I don't know how to be okay with this." Emily was quiet for a moment, and I could feel her gaze on me, heavy and warm, but not judgmental. She knew I was struggling. She knew it wasn't easy for me. But in some way, I think she also knew that I was capable of more than I thought, that I had the strength to face the things that scared me. "I'm not asking you to be okay with everything all at once," she said gently. "I just want you to be here, with me. For this." The words hit me in a way I wasn't prepared for. They cracked something open in me, something I had kept tightly sealed away. Be here. That was all she was asking of me. To be present. To be alive in this moment. To stop running from the fear of what the future might hold. I turned around to face her, finally allowing myself to meet her eyes. And in them, I saw something that took me by surprise. Hope. Hope that I could find my way through this. Hope that there was still a place for me in this future, no matter how uncertain or messy it seemed. "I'm here," I said. And for the first time in a long while, I meant it. I don't have all the answers. I don't even know what the right thing to do is. But I'm here. Later that day, Emily and I sat down together. No distractions, no walls between us. We needed to talk, not about Mark or the baby, but about us. About what this all meant for our relationship, and more importantly, about how we could start finding our way back to each other. The conversation was slow at first, each word carefully considered. We spoke about the fear I had been holding on to, the resentment I hadn't known I'd been carrying. We spoke about the uncertainty of the future and how neither of us knew how to map out a path forward. But we both knew it wasn't about having a plan anymore. It was about the willingness to move through it together. "I don't want to lose you, James," she said softly, her voice breaking slightly. "I don't want to lose us." And that was it. The pivotal moment that broke through all the confusion I had been feeling. It wasn't about Mark. It wasn't about the baby. It was about us. About the bond we shared. The love that had once been so strong it had carried us through everything, even when it felt like we were on the edge of collapse. And now, I understood. I understood that the love was still there. It wasn't gone. It was just buried, waiting to be uncovered, waiting for me to trust it again. That night, after our conversation, I lay next to Emily again, but this time it was different. The crossroads of fatherhood. James's emotional evolution. The days following that quiet night were filled with a mixture of tentative steps and deeper introspection. I had made a commitment to myself and to Emily. I would try. I would fight against the instincts that told me to withdraw, to shield myself from this overwhelming swirl of emotions. But the battle wasn't just about facing Mark or even accepting the pregnancy. It was about confronting my own insecurities. The fear of being inadequate, of not being enough. Every time I glanced at Emily, I saw a strength in her that I wasn't sure I possessed. She was calm, poised, yet there was something vulnerable about her. It wasn't just the pregnancy, it was the weight of her decisions, the path she had chosen to walk, and she had chosen me, at least for now. That was both a comfort and a burden. Could I truly be enough for her? For the child? I couldn't escape the question. It lingered in my thoughts like a shadow, growing longer as the days went on. One evening, while Emily was in the kitchen preparing dinner, I found myself on the couch once more, my fingers resting lightly against the fabric of the cushions. The stillness of the apartment seemed to press down on me, a quiet reminder of how much my life had shifted. The past few weeks had blurred together, filled with a constant ebb and flow of emotions, hope, fear, anger, and confusion. All of it had been leading me to this place, to this moment where I had to decide if I was willing to embrace what was coming, or if I would continue to live in the shadow of my own doubts. I glanced over at Emily as she moved about the kitchen, her soft humming filling the space. It was so normal, so simple. But everything was different now. She looked up, catching my gaze, her eyes soft but knowing. There was a quiet understanding between us, unspoken but tangible. It was clear that, while we hadn't completely figured things out, we were both willing to try. That was the thread that held us together. "James," she said, her voice pulling me from my thoughts, "I've been thinking about how we move forward." I swallowed, suddenly feeling exposed. The weight of those words settled heavily in the room. "I know it's hard to think about right now," she continued, "but I want us to start making plans, not just for the baby, but for us, for our future." I could feel the tension building in my chest again. The weight of her words pressed against my ribs, each one a reminder of what I didn't know how to do. I wasn't prepared for the future. I wasn't ready for the responsibility. I'm not sure I'm the man you need me to be," I confessed, my voice cracking with the rawness of the admission. "I've been so caught up in my own fear that I don't know how to be what you need, what the baby needs." She stopped what she was doing, setting the spoon down carefully, and slowly turned to face me. Her eyes softened, filled with empathy that cut straight through my defenses. "You're already here," she said quietly, her words simple but powerful. "That's all I need from you, James. We'll figure the rest out. Together." The sincerity in her voice, the weight of her belief in me, cracked something deep inside. I had been so afraid of losing her, of not measuring up, that I had failed to see what we had built, the foundation that was already there. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was enough. In the days that followed, I began to take small steps toward acceptance. I spent more time with Emily, helping her with the preparations for the baby. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when I felt utterly inadequate, when the weight of the responsibility felt like it might crush me. But as we worked together, I began to feel a shift in myself. We were building something. It was slow. It was uncertain. But it was ours. I watched her one evening, her hand resting on her growing belly as she hummed a soft lullaby under her breath. Her expression was peaceful, her eyes closed, and for a brief moment, I saw the woman she was before all the chaos, before Mark, before everything that had changed. She was still there, a part of her still mine. I couldn't help but feel a wave of guilt that I had let myself drift so far away from her. But I also realized something else. This wasn't about the past. It wasn't about what had been broken. It was about the future. And as much as I feared it, I was starting to understand that it was worth the fight. Later that night, I lay beside her once more, This time not in silence, but in a soft, shared conversation about what lay ahead. We talked about everything, about the baby, about the unknowns, about what we wanted for our lives moving forward. But most importantly, we talked about us. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a genuine connection to her again. Not the tentative connection of two people unsure of what would come next,